laws of physics, there's just as much reality to the future and the past as there is to the present moment.
The past is not gone, and the future isn't non-existent. The past, the future, and the present are all existing in exactly the same way.
Just as we think of all of space as being out there, we should think of all of time as being out there too. Everything that has ever happened or will happen, it all exists.
And welcome back to part 11 of Migration. We are doing something exciting, a little bit different with the next couple of episodes. I'm actually going to flush out one of my personal stories with astral projection and lucid dreaming. And I've not really done that on this show before. I've always kind of felt that I was really using all of these podcasts and radio interviews that I've been doing over the last few years to do just that, to kind of explain exactly what had been happening with me and my experiences. And I wanted to use this show to offer the audience something a little bit more substantial. I wanted to offer everyone the mechanics behind these experiences so people could theoretically follow in my footsteps. Basically, I didn't want to just entertain people with my stories, because in the end, what does any of that really do for you? Without understanding how lucid dreaming, out-of-body experiences, telepathy, and spontaneous healing work, I feel like the audience is just going, well, either he's telling the truth, or he's crazy, or he's just simply full of shit. And I want to offer you something a little more nutritious. And so, with that disclaimer out of the way, hell with it, I'm going to do it anyway. And it might be fun to see how well I could illustrate some of my experiences with computer graphics and artwork and some of these overlays I've been working with to try to illustrate some of these very abstract points. So, what I've done is I've decided to do both here. So here in part 1, I'm going to lay out the setting of my first astral projection, where I carry you through the important precursors, and I give you all the important behind-the-scenes info that I can. So then later in part 2, I'm simply just going to tell the story of my first experience, which took place around the age of 19. And if I had to classify what category the experience fell under, it's an astral projection, but I projected into somebody else's body who lived, I sense, around 200 years ago, maybe more, maybe a lot more. And for about 3 minutes, I observed a scene play out through this other person's eyes. Now, this idea of consciously time traveling is so confusing. It's so bizarre, but it's also so interesting that I didn't want to just tell you the story and leave it at that. I want to be able to offer you the exact mechanics behind this and explain, how is this possible? How can you possibly tap into some of these experiences? So that is what we're going to lay out today in part 11. So stick around and stay tuned. With over 30 years of first-hand experience with lucid dreaming, radical healing, astral projection, and paranormal states of consciousness, I've come to develop a unified theory about the mechanics behind all of these fantastic powers, which everyone has access to. I've learned that our consciousness is not a localized phenomenon. It only appears to be an isolated point of awareness living somewhere behind our eyes, because we've latched onto stories that have convinced us this is the case since we were born into this world. It is our very attachment to these narratives that appears to bind us to the cage of the physical mind and body. Through this series, we're embarking on an adventure to explore this relationship we carry with storylines and symbolism, so that we can, once and for all, dispel this faulty notion that our awareness, our true identity has ever been limited and localized within the brain. I am not speaking of a supernatural gift that only the holy or the gifted can tap into. In fact, I'm personally an atheist. I'm referring to a perfectly natural phenomenon that most people won't realize until their physical body passes away. But why wait, when you can take advantage of your incredible potential now? Welcome to a journey to a brand new landscape. Welcome to migration. Alright, so right off the bat, let's get a few things clear about this first experience of mine. This came about completely spontaneously. At the time, I did nothing out of the ordinary to kick in this experience. I had no experience with psychoactives when this occurred. At the time this happened, I knew nothing about lucid dreaming or astral projection, and I never considered the idea that our consciousness may have access not only to other places, but other times. If I would have heard the stories that I have now when I was a teenager, I would have thought there was probably something wrong with you, that you were just somehow mistaken or you were just simply lying. I would say that the only thing I really did have going for me at the time of my first experience was that I had a natural way of looking at the world as a high-functioning autistic, specifically in the way I have a general disconnect with all narratives, which of course has been the primary focus of this series. Now, where I'm at today, I know that our consciousness has access to everything that has and ever will happen. It is the ground state of all existence. It is not localized within the body. It's not localized at all. It is closer to the nature of a wave and not a particle, unless, of course, we convince ourselves that it is. It's a phenomenon that exists below not just matter and energy, but linear time. It sees the universe from past to present to future as all happening in the now. If that sounds hard to swallow, if that sounds like completely absurd science fiction, then you don't really realize the truth, that the real mystery is why we experience time in a linear fashion at all. From the perspective of physics, the entire history and future, the full past and present of the cosmos, is actually more like one massive, physicist Brian Greene sometimes calls it a massive loaf of bread, and we only experience small slices of that loaf. That's right, the entirety of the cosmos from start to finish, if there are such things, behaves as one completely interconnected phenomenon. I'll add some links below where Brian Greene does a really wonderful job explaining exactly why that works, but I'm going to leave that to the experts. And if that topic of how time works beyond our human perception really fascinates you, I highly recommend his book, The Fabric of the Cosmos. Okay, so let's explore exactly what I'm talking about here. Let's imagine we could stand back and look at the entire cosmos from start to finish, the same way we could see any object in existence. Now, of course, there is no way to even visualize such a thing. It would be like if I asked you for a single photograph, one single JPEG of what you did between 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. yesterday. It would be just visual chaos. But let's imagine we could somehow just tear a hole in our linear world of structure that moves from the past to the present on to the future, and we could stand back and look at the entire phenomenon of the universe at once. I'm talking totally stepping outside of the very concept of time. So what you're looking at now, that single churning structure, is everything that has and will ever happen everywhere at once. So from both the perspective of physics and the perspective of pure consciousness, they see the whole universe like this from start to finish as one massive churning object. In fact, you might think of the black area that this entire structure is suspended within as consciousness itself. It permeates everything from start to finish. And keep in mind, If theoretical notions like the superstring theory are indeed correct, this churning mass of energy you're looking at includes the multiverse as well. That's every possible direction the universe can take. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's pull back before this gets too complicated. Okay, so if this is reality, why don't we see it like this? Because we're peering at this impossibly massive, complex structure from an ant's perspective. That consciousness that permeates everything from start to finish becomes sort of attached to a single point, an individual mass that moves through the tiniest section of that universe in a limited path, following the flow of entropy from order to disorder. That mass that consciousness connects itself to is, of course, in our case, the human body. Specifically, it connects to the narratives of the human mind. And the further we take this, you'll see how relevant that distinction is. So consciousness sees the universe from this larger perspective whenever it is completely detached from a limited narrative. And this happens in varying degrees. It's a one-way trip when your body dies for good, for example. But we can get a taste of this even just when the body falls asleep, or when the body is traumatized and shuts down, or it goes into an altered state of consciousness from either meditation or psychoactives. It begins returning to its natural point of view, which is, again, literally everything at once. The probability wave before we've opened Schrodinger's box. We're talking full potential. I can tell you firsthand that a massive dose of DMT can feel like you're dying, and there's a very good reason for that. It's a preview, you could say, of what's to come. So let's talk about some of the details that allowed me to enter this realm for the first time. This first experience into this area occurred one morning at around 6 a.m. What happened is that my mom woke me up so I could drive her to work because I needed to use the car later that day. But then after I dropped her off, I went back to sleep for a couple hours, which, little did I know, I had just perfectly primed myself for entering a lucid state. Why? Because this is what happened. I got up and I had to be fully awake, and then I went back to sleep for just a short amount of time. So my awareness had to go from deep sleep and fuzzy dreamland attached to random subconscious hypnagogic imagery to present moment awareness in order to operate the car. So when I fell back asleep later, my mind had been fully awake, but my body was still very tired. I was still a growing teenager. So when my body went into sleep paralysis, my mind hadn't caught up yet. It was still fully conscious. Now, consciously entering sleep paralysis can be absolutely terrifying. There is no doubt about that, but we'll talk about that another time because it's a whole other can of worms. But the conditions it offers are perfect. Your body is shut down from conscious control, which offers your consciousness the same opportunity to move beyond it, just like it does for people who experience near-death experiences. The same basic conditions apply here. I have now studied hundreds of other people's near-death experience reports, and what I began experiencing on a regular basis, they're exact matches. We're telling the same stories. We're describing the same exact process. Of course, the major difference being that people who have had near-death experiences generally only experience them once during some rare, unusual, traumatic event. And of course, they come back and they say how life-changing it was, how their whole philosophy of life and death had changed. There's actually a wonderful show right now on Netflix called Surviving Death that features a lot of these stories that mirror my own in so many ways. And in my own case, I began having these experiences nearly every night after that first experience. That first experience that I'm going to flush out in the next part, that was sort of the one that kicked off another 15 years or more of nearly nightly experiences into this realm, sometimes lasting from anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes up to a couple hours at a time. So as I've mentioned, I don't tend to lucid dream all that much right now in my older life because I've moved the bulk of that attention away from my nightlife into my daily life so I can start manifesting my dreams in my daily life. So in my case, I was having these highly intense, world-shattering experiences nearly every day, which probably explains what makes me a bit odd, but it also may help explain why I can speak about these things as if I've gone to some sort of astral projection university at some point. This ultimate perspective of everything the universe has and ever will be that resides beyond linear time is the basis for so many famous insights throughout human history, which have become part of our world cultures. It's what religions, shamanism, and spirituality have tried to describe in one way or another since we acquired language. But, of course, this state of awareness is something we all have equal claim to. That consciousness I'm pointing to is what is at the core of everyone and everything. What is literally peering through your eyes right now as you watch this video is this consciousness we all share. But again, it's buried beneath years of domestication and beliefs and assumptions, i.e., narratives. And this is the same state of consciousness that so many of our world's scientists even have gone into to pluck out their most renowned theories of the cosmos. So many of history's geniuses, from Isaac Newton to Albert Einstein, have talked about how they arrived at their insights, not while staring at books or going over data or while, performing mathematical calculations. They were arrived at while they were at rest in a sort of meditative state, staring at a fireplace, wandering around outside, or right before they fell asleep, just when their imagination was wandering. So as is the case with me during my first experience, as I said, my body fell asleep and my consciousness temporarily detached from, you could say, the story of Ian, and temporarily adhered to another body in a different point in time. And as I'll explain in the story, it then moved away from that character's narrative and then expanded back to that primal view of the entire universe at once, temporarily, before collapsing back into my limited linear perspective of Ian. Okay, so that's the basic mechanics underneath this story that I'm going to be telling next time. And it's important to understand this perspective because so often when we think of astral projection, we imagine that there's some magical substance, some ball of energy that rises up out of the body and then, drifts out into the world. When it's more about this all-encompassing consciousness gradually pulling back from this tunnel vision of one body moving through a tiny section of the universe. So when we return next time, I'll be flushing out the exact storyline of what actually happened to me during that first experience. But now hopefully you have a larger perspective for what's really at the heart of near-death experiences and astral projection and remote viewing and on. And hopefully you're starting to understand how all of these really are completely interconnected. So until next time, thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, share this with others if you're enjoying this video. It really does help me a lot. So thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.